This is the largest Resin 3D printer that I have ever used. It's the Emake3D Galaxy one that's live over on Kickstarter. There's still technically a few days left in the campaign as of the time of posting this. And in today's video, I'm gonna be giving you my thoughts on working with this machine over the past few days, and if you should consider backing one of these enormous Resin 3D printers for yourself. And before we jump into this 3D printer, and yes, I literally think I might be able to fit inside this 3D printer, I wanted to reiterate that it is a Kickstarter campaign machine, and there's some inherent risk with backing any Kickstarter campaign. However, I am fairly confident in the Emake3D team and what I have seen so far with this machine. I also think, I can't confirm this, but I believe they're the manufacturer of the Epax3D line of 3D printers, which I've shown off here in the channel in the past. But they did send this machine out to myself to provide feedback and make some content for you all. I know the 3D Printing Nerd has already produced a video on his, and I'll have a link to that below. And Akuma Mods also has one of these, and I'll have a link to his channel so you can check out his content that he's producing on this 3D printer. Looking at the features of this machine, the big standout is obviously going to be the massive build volume for this printer, coming in at 400 by 200 by 400 millimeters high. And if I compare this to some of my larger Resin 3D printers, the one that I probably use the most is my Elegoo Jupiter, and this thing dwarfs it in size. It's like significantly larger with its build volume. And then if I take a look at the Frozen Mega 8K, you're also looking at a little bit larger of a build volume on the Galaxy One compared to that Resin 3D printer. This thing also comes extremely well packaged and packed in a crate that I was able to dolly in here. You're gonna need two people for sure once you get the thing unboxed to actually lift it up onto a table or shelf or wherever it is that you're planning on placing this thing. It weighs easily over 100 pounds, so don't throw your back out with it. But the other really cool thing is once I got everything unboxed and all the packing material out of here, I was able to just directly throw on the build plate, pour in some resin, and start printing. That's because the build plate comes auto leveled, and they're saying that you're not going to need to re-level that. However, if you do, it looks like there are some bolts on there that you can go back in and tweak that if needed. There's also a heater unit on the inside that Joel Telling actually found out an issue. The default temperature that came with this machine was, I think, 28, which was way too hot and was causing issues with his prints. So it was advised to lower it down to 25. So that's what I've been printing with for all the prints that I'll be showing off here in the video. And I'm thinking I might even be able to drop that down just ever so slightly. But what's nice about it is it's not really loud, and it's only going to run when it needs to pump in some more heat to keep things at temperature. The other thing that this printer is sporting is on the side is a panel that you can open up that houses 2 bottles of resin, one of which will be connected to an auto feeder that will automatically feed resin back into the vat as you're printing, which is just amazing. That vat itself holds easily 2 liters of resin, probably even more than that. And what's really cool is on the inside of the printer, there is a sensor that you can control exactly how high you want it to detect the actual auto feeding to kick on and basically start feeding more resin into the vat for you. The other really big difference between this printer and most of the other Resin 3D printers that I've shown off on this channel here is that this is an SLA Resin 3D printer, meaning it's going to work with lasers instead of a display screen that displays an image that goes layer after layer to cure and process your prints. This uses a laser that's going to reflect off of a mirror to project the image in little laser light show fashion across each individual layer for each part of the print. But keep in mind that since this is an SLA machine, it is definitely going to print significantly slower than I've typically seen on most of the other Resin 3D printers that I work with, just because it takes longer for it to process each of those layers for your different 3D prints. And while the Galaxy One might print slower than most of the Resin 3D printers that I've shown off on the channel here, the one big advantage that it has is that it's using the mirror laser combination and is going to have a significantly longer print lifespan than most of those other MSLA Resin 3D printers. And they're claiming that this machine is going to have a print lifespan of over 20,000 print hours, which is just insane to me. And to give you a comparison, my Frozen Mega 8K, the screen died after somewhere around 100 to 200 hours of working with that machine, and I ended up having to buy a new screen replacement. It was $450, and I think now it's even more expensive. I think it's over $500 for a replacement screen for that really large MSLA Resin 3D printer. All right, let's talk about a few different things about the machine here. First of all, let's open this up, and inside is the build plate here. You're gonna have the two knobs at the top, and you've got little nubby handles on the side to take this off. I do wish the handles were slightly larger so that you could get a better grip with this. The build plate surface is extremely well for adhesion to the resin prints that I've tried working with so far. Maybe way too well, because I've had just a nightmare getting them off of the build plate, and it just ended up making just a massive mess in the process a lot of the time here. Another thing just to let you know of as well is when removing the bolts here, be careful, because you just have to screw them ever so slightly for them to loosen up, or else they'll just completely come off. There's like a little bit of a nub there for the bolts to screw onto, and you just got to be careful playing around with that. Talking about the heater unit, this thing works pretty well. It's fairly silent as well when it's up and running. Here you can actually hear, it's like an ambient fan running on the inside here, but compared to most of the MSLA Resin 3D printers, this thing is so much quieter, and I was expecting this to be a lot noisier than it is. This thing is super quiet compared to most of the other printers, and I believe it's because it's not trying to actively keep a screen cool throughout the printing process here, which is just a nice change of pace here. One thing, I don't know if it's possible or not, but there's no way, as far as I can tell, to turn the heater unit off. So I'll have to play around with it more, but there's not like a power button that you can click. And I've tried holding different buttons down, and I can't seem to turn it off, which would be nice, especially during the summertime when it's really hot in here. I don't need the heater unit at all on. Oh, also the build plate lowers extremely fast. Anybody that's got one of these larger Resin 3D printers are probably used to it lifting and lowering very slow and taking minutes in some cases for it to lift and lower all the way. This thing is like 20 seconds for it to go all the way down and start printing, or when it's done printing, go all the way back up to the top. It's super quick. As I mentioned before, the vat holds just a ton of resin, so make sure you're stocked up on resin if you're planning on working with this machine. It can be a little bit of a challenge to remove the vat, especially when it's full of resin, and try and pour that back into its individual bottles, but that's no different than any of these other large Resin 3D printers, unless you have like a syringe or some kind of pump that's going to help you remove the resin before taking it out of the vat itself. The vat's also held in place by 4 bolts. Again, sort of nubby on the thing. I just need to get used to it. That's all. It's just different than some of the other printers, and they are fairly small, but it's good size handles on the vat for pulling it out. One call out that I did have about this screen, I'm not entirely sure if there's any sort of screen protector on there. I see some kind of film over the screen. I'm not sure what that is exactly, but it would be great if Emake team could actually clarify if there is a screen protector on this or not, because obviously if you puncture a hole in your FEP sheet and you get resin on the screen, you don't want to ruin this thing, this massive machine, and look at replacing one of those there. So also would be interested to know, is it just a piece of glass that's underneath it? What all is that exactly would be great to know. Also, there's no tape around the edges, so there's definitely a seam that if resin spilled underneath the vat, it would pour into the actual printer. So that is a bit of a concern. I was surprised that there wasn't any sort of tape around the edges of that screen. So before I go in and talk about the touch screen, this really large touch screen on the printer, the files that you're going to print from are loaded onto an SD card that can be placed into the front of the machine, which is amazing. It's not on the side or the back or anything crazy like that. So nice and easy on the front, and it's just using a standard SD card reader and a micro SD card. You can probably use any sort of combination you like with that. But one weird thing about this is the printer itself won't work without that SD card plugged into it. So if you power off the machine, take out the SD card, then power on the machine, it just won't work. It gives you all sorts of crazy error messages there until you plug that SD card in there, and I'm not entirely sure why. So it obviously has this massive touchscreen display on it. This is where you're going to actually control which prints you want to actually print with. This is also going to have all of your different printer settings that you can actually refine and change. So one big difference for this machine to most other Resin 3D printers that I've shown is that the machine itself is going to control all of the different settings that you're going to print with, except for your layer resolution. That's going to come from your sliced file in your slicer. So none of those other settings that you typically deal with in your slicer are applicable there. It's all going to be managed directly here on the front interface. Now, one big call out that I have that I'm not enjoying so far about this is that there's not a way to save profiles. So if I wanted to create a Soriatech fast profile versus a flexible resin profile versus the Emake3D resin profile, there's no way for me to do that other than to just manually keep changing the settings before I start up a print, which is kind of annoying. I'm assuming you're gonna have to have like a spreadsheet or something to save that you can remember those. It would be nice if there was an interface to access that you could actually save these as different profiles that you could then access, tweak, and edit or use as part of the print job. A few other things that I would like to see adjusted if possible with the touchscreen interface is you have a beautiful touchscreen interface here. Why aren't we seeing any images of the print? Like when I go in here to start the print, can I not get a little preview of what it was that I was about to print to make sure that I'm printing the correct file? I would have thought that would have been there. The other massively odd thing to me is you'll see this button on the front of the printer. And if you watch Joel's video, the 3D Printing Nerds video, he was like, hey, what does this do? It doesn't do anything. And it doesn't. Right now, it doesn't do anything. I thought this was the power button at first. It's not. This is the print pause button. So as you're printing, and if you want to pause the print, you hit this button and then wait. I don't know what you're waiting for, maybe for the layer to finish processing. And then it will prompt something on screen for you to unpress the button. So you unpress the button, and then it gives you touchscreen interface options to either resume or cancel the print. It's a very odd thing. The touchscreen does literally nothing. You can't do anything with it mid-print. So there's no controls, so you can't tweak any of the settings. You can't obviously cancel the print from the touchscreen while a print is active. It's very odd. Also, the print time information, just the print job information is like, why aren't we utilizing the full screen? There's super tiny text that shows you what the print time is for your print job. I would imagine that should be a lot larger for this touch screen. Like we're using a fraction of this large touch screen. It feels like we could just be better utilizing it. Oh, and I almost forgot, when the print job finishes, you would expect, like most printers, you'd be able to see a summary of your print job and how long it took and maybe how many layers it was. No. Not with this machine. After, I think it's like 30 seconds to 1 minute, it completely goes back to this screen. So the print job finishes, you might see whatever that last set of layer information and print job information was, and then it just disappears and goes back to this screen. It would be really great if it just maintained that so I could actually see how long this print job took. And before I actually show off some of the prints, I did want to also mention how prints are actually sliced. They passed along a version of, it's a beta version of Chitubox Pro that I was able to use that had a profile for this printer that I was able to go in, load some files in, do all the supporting and all that other fun stuff, and then slice the files. Again, you're not gonna have to worry about any of those parameters that you would typically deal with in your Resin 3D printers. That's all managed on the printer itself. So all you really have to be concerned with on the machine is the layer height as well as your support settings, and it's gonna generate a .qdt file, which takes forever for it to generate. And I'm talking like 30 plus minutes for this file to actually process and generate for you to actually be able to run off and 3D print it. It is probably the most painful process so far that I've had with this machine, or any of the machines, is just getting a file sliced, and the files are enormous in size. And I'm assuming it's just because of the type of file that is needed. It was, I think, 1 gig to 2 gigs was what I was seeing for the files that I had printed with this machine. So they're massive files that just take a really long time to process and render or whatever it is that it's doing. All right, so enough about the machine itself. Let's take a look at some of the things that I've actually printed on it. First up is a build plate full of files that I printed from FotisMint as well as Wekster. So I printed FotisMint's aliens bust here. The detail on this turned out amazing. Everything was sliced at 0.05 millimeter layer height here. And for the most part, the details on this are looking nice, crisp, and clear. I used all of the default profile settings that the Emake team passed along for the Galaxy 1. And for all of the prints that I'm showing in the video, I'm using their Emake3D resin, and I do have plans on using some other resins like Tech resin, some of my Elegoo resin on this machine to see how it looks. I just didn't have enough time and wanted to get this video out before the Kickstarter campaign ends. His buddy Charo does all of the support work for the file here. I couldn't even get it captured on screen. They came off so seamlessly here. Man, I need to take a lesson from him on how to actually do my supports for Resin 3D prints, because the next file I supported myself. This is from Wekster and it's his clicker mask, and I must have used my auto heavy supports versus typically what I do is auto medium supports, and then I'll go back and add a few heavy supports. I must have not been paying attention and did auto heavy, because these prints are almost, the supports are almost impossible to remove, but the print itself looks really nice and clean. And I just like this as an example of showing what this print could look like, you know, with the supports still on it. I also printed the stand with it as well, made sure to hollow this out to help save on some of the resin, but the details on the mask are looking really nice and good. Again, no major callouts that I'm seeing or issues with either of these print files. I mean, if I get really close, I'll try to get some really close-up details here to see some of the more intricacies of the prints, but for the most part, these files are looking great. I'm very happy with the results I'm seeing from these two sets of prints. And for the second print, I ended up using the entire build plate surface, and I think it took around 24 to 25 hours to print, and it is this massive Thanos statue from Wicked3D. Unfortunately, the hands ended up failing on the 3D print during the process there, and come to find out it was because these were solid files. They weren't hollowed out like all of the other ones there, and I think were just too heavy and pulled away from the sports as it was mid-printing, so I need to go back and reprint these. In the meantime, I did run off and print them on my Bamboo Lab X1 Carbon. They look pretty good in PLA, but they could look a lot better here in resin. Something else that I'm noticing as I was starting to assemble this statue together is that some of the parts aren't exactly accurate. So it looks like there was a little bit of warping going on when the print was printing. So maybe some of the parts came loose from the supports. I'm not quite sure. Everything was extremely well secured to the build plate, like crazy secured. This is like one of the biggest issues that I have, is that I just need to, I think, go in and play around with the settings on the machine. The bottom exposure was just way too high and almost impossible to remove any of the prints from the actual build plate without chiseling them off. It's just painful, really painful to go through, and messy, I should say. But I think in the end, you should be able to get some really good looking prints off of this machine with the right set of settings and playing around with those. I also did see some other issues with this file. Again, I'm not quite sure if it was the prints separating from the supports or what, but I do have, like on the head, there's a layer separation issue where the print sort of just separated from itself slightly. I'm also seeing some additional lines throughout this print in certain areas, but for the most part, it looks really good. Unfortunately, the one big issue I have that I'll probably have to figure out and reprint is this one leg just looks like it's way off on one of the parts, and I've got to figure out which one it is. But other than that, the print itself, I'm very happy with. And for the most part, I think if you are interested in a really large Resin 3D printer and you don't mind it taking a good bit longer to print than your other Resin 3D printers out there, especially if you want one that's going to have a really long lifespan, then this is probably the perfect printer for you. The print quality that I'm seeing is pretty good. It's maybe not the best looking Resin 3D prints that I've ever seen, but it's still phenomenal. And I think the price point, I think, is around $15.50 for the machine right now over on the Kickstarter campaign. Is a pretty good price, and it's a massive, again, massive build volume, heated chamber there, auto resin feeding. Some of the things that I've called out can hopefully be addressed with some of the improvements to the overall software or hardware, not hardware, but software to the machine. And things like slicing isn't necessarily this printer, it's more on the Chitu box side of things, but maybe another file format could be used. I don't know. I just like playing around with these sort of things and sharing them with you guys. But let me know what your thoughts are on this massive Resin 3D printer. And if you're interested in backing one of these, or you know, if you have something else on your that you're eyeing there for your Resin 3D printing needs. But I'm excited to get some Resin 3D prints back up and running here in the studio. It's been a while since I've done any Resin 3D prints, and I want to say a huge thank you to all of my Patreon supporters for your continued support. If you're interested in things like my Resin 3D printer settings, not necessarily this machine settings because I haven't really had a chance to play around with them yet, but you can find those over in my Patreon. Hey, thanks so much for watching, you all. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and yeah, definitely check out Akuma Mods. I'll have some links to his channel and Joel Telling's video down below on the same machine. Hey, thanks so much for watching, you all. I'll see you next time.